So we've looked at our CRUD operations. By now you should know what they are and what they do. But we want to proceed and use an actual database, moving away from our repository. So there has to be a mechanism through which one can talk to a database. So we have many options to talk to a database, but we'll use what we call entity framework call. And this is just an ORM. This is what we call an object relational mapper. So it's able to map your objects in your C# objects and the tables in your database, so object relation, and then it's able to see the relationships. So what we'll do is we'll begin with the code, then create a database. We call that code first approach. So we need to bring in entity framework call into our application. So right click on your project, then select NuGet package managers. We're going to bring in entity framework call. So wire up entity framework call. We'll install the framework call. Make sure it's 9 since we're using .NET 9. If it's 8, you would use 8. Okay, accept that. Then we can bring in SQL Server, since when I use a SQL Server database. If it's Postgres, if you use Postgres. If it's in memory, you use in memory. As well as for the non-SQL, like the MongoDBs, it's also supported, excuse me. And then we install, so we've done then we'll put the tools. The tools are what we use for the code first approach. Once the tools are in, Entity Framework has a concept that we talk about. It's called a DbContext. So a context is a window through which you talk to a database. So everything you do to talk to your database revolves around the context, and you'll see it as we go. So we want to use the context as a window to talk to our database. If you want to create our database, we use the context. If you want to manipulate that in our database, we use the context. So in our models, I'll call it a book DbContext book. Books DbContext. So everything will flow through this. So what you do is we're going to say, let this inherit from the DbContext, which is entity framework call. And what you would do here is to bring in a constructor that will take in what we call a DB context options. And these context options will just need to know what sort of DB context you have. And that's our DB context. So we'll put it there, call that options. So we have to pass it the options so that it knows the properties within when it starts creating, and you'll see where we give it the options. And the options goes to the base class, which is a DB context. So it has a place where it will need that context. So that's done. The next question is we need to have our DB tables, right? In this case, we'll have books. So we'll create what we call a DB set of type book. And this will be called books. Then I always like to start some data in my database. I always want to seed in some data so that I can test the endpoints. So there's a method called onModel_creating. If you override that, you can tell it what to do. There are things you can put there like validations. You can put things like entity relationships, and we'll see them in subsequent videos. So I'll say override onModel_creating. It's called onModel_creating. So I'll say model builder dot entity. The entity has to be book. I want to say has data. Like so. Then I'll do that. So what I can do to make this fast, I can just go to my book repository and I can just seed those 4 books. 4 books, and I can just bring them here. So we have these 4 books that we'll use to seed in our database. So you see, everything is running within the context. Everything revolves around the context. The creation of the table, the location where the database is, it'll come to the options, and even just seeding your data there, you can put it within that. but we don't know where the database exists. In fact, the database does not yet exist. So remember we talked about Appsettings.json, where everything configurations are done there. So ideally, you would have to install SQL Server on your machine. You'd have to install Microsoft SQL Server or maybe Azure Data Store, then test it. But Microsoft Visual Studio has a what we call a SQL Server Express within it. So you don't have to install anything. So we'll use that for now so that we just focus on how to do it. We can do a separate video for database if you want. You can just put in the comments. So what you do here is you bring in what we call a connection string. So connection string, use that one because the dependency injection container will know that it has built-in functionality to get that. So we'll call this default connection, right? So where does this, so this is the, if you go to view SQL Server object, it's where you get that object what I was talking about, and we'll play with that. So that one is located at, you put local db, then forward slash Microsoft SQL local db. That's where it exists. So server, if it's on an Azure cloud or something, you put your port, your URL to that particular thing, and you go there and you create if the credentials are okay in the permissions. So database name, it will be the database name book management. Trusted connection is true. We are saying that if I'm logged in onto my machine, let me just go through without having to authenticate using username and password, then allow multiple things results to be there. So we're saying that's where the database will be, but it's not yet there. So in our program.cs, we have what we call the dependency injection container. So everything that will be used over and over again, we have to register it once in our DB context, in our dependency injection container. Then we can just use it easily in other places without the need to reconfigure. So I'll say builder dot services, then I'll say add DbContext. And what was our DbContext? Books DbContext, right? Books DbContext. And we have to give it the options. Remember, in the DbContext, it needs to have the options to know. So now we're giving that options, which will go straight to the DbContext via the base over there. So I will say options. It goes through that. Then I can say, on the options, I want you to add one thing, which is use SQL Server. But it takes in the connection string. Where is your SQL Server? So we'll say builder. On the builder, there's what we call a configuration. And if you tell it get connection string, it will go and get that connection string. That's why I had stressed to say, make sure in your app settings you put this key code connection string, because it will know. But we want to get the default connections because you can have multiple connection strings. So give it that connection. At this juncture, we have done our context, told it the table and what to do. We've told our DI container to say add the DbContext as our service dependency. We have put our connection string to say this is where it exists. We have to now create the actual database. So we'll go to tools, then NuGet package manager console. Then the two important commands. One is called add -migration. I'll call this db creation. So make the name of the migration that makes sense, because you do several. So you have to know, if you revert back, you should know that this is what I had done. If you put nothing, if you put a garbage name there, you will struggle. So if I put db creation, I will know that this is the time that I was creating my database. So it will proceed, and it will create a migration. You see there's a folder there called migration. Interesting. What's in the migration? There are two things. You see there's a method called up and there's a method called down. So in the app method, you see that it's creating a table called books. The ID And the framework has already inferred to say this is your primary key. So it'll give it an identity, which means it will auto increment. So there'll be no need for us to do like last time to get the last key, the maximum, and then add. Then you see there it has this, the primary key is there, and there's a function called insert data. So it's going to seed that data. If I use the down method, then I'll drop the table. But a migration is not a sign that you have a database. You have to effect that. If I want to undo the migration, I'll put remove migration. But since I'm okay with it, I'll put update hyphen database. This will create the actual database. So you see there, it ran a command of create the table, then it added the insert there. If we go to view and we go to SQL Server Object Explorer, we could go to the local DB there. So in case you don't have a local DB, it's not there, you can go and add it there. When you click add there, what you put here, you put that server name, local DB / SQL Server, then you put Windows authentication over there. If you put SQL Server authentication, then you have to put password. So put Windows authentication and the name of your server. Then in your connection string, you put that. That should also work in case you're having any challenges. So I will go databases and I'll see this book management database, and there's what we call tables there. If I go to the tables, I should expect to have one table called books, but wrong, there'll be two tables. The other one is what we call the migration history. That one is used to track your migration history. So don't worry about that. If I right click on that and say, show me the data, view data. So you will see that there it gives me the data that's in the books. So our database part is set. Now we're going to proceed to creating the endpoints, just like we did with the first part. Now we get our endpoint. So we have one controller, books controller. I'll create another controller called books DB controller so that we do not mix the two. And if you want to go through the code, it'll be easier to follow that way. So create an API controller and call this controller books DB controller. So it'll be books DB controller. Right. Now, if we do not have the dependency injection container here, where we added the database there, we'd have to do this at every place. This is a context. This is where it exists. But because we've got the we have the DbContext already in our database, DI container, then it's easier just to bring it here. So what we'll do is I'll have a constructor. So this is called constructor dependency injection. So I'll inject whatever my constructor depends on. I've noticed the B there, small letter, just for the sake of information. I'll put a capital B. All right, capital B, and there put a capital B. So we'll inject our dependency, which is the books DB controller, and that's books DB context. My apologies. Books DB context. We'll call it DB context, if that makes sense. And then we're going to bring in a control dot. You're going to create and assign a field called DB context, which we're going to write on. So I like to put underscores. So we said that everything will revolve around the context. You'll see, for us to create the table, the database, we had to use the context. So even now, for us to manipulate, we need to use the context. So our first aspect is the CRUD, which is we'll start with the get. Our first thing would be to get all. And I'll just make it asynchronous, so I'll use all in something. So asynchronous is where we use the async await. So we'll say public. I can say async task. Yeah, so it's done that for me. So what has happened here? Bringing in the framework code, we're saying in the context dot books. It means you could have so many things in the context. You could have books, you could have person, you could have maybe authors, publishers. other table. So you get the context dot your table you want to. In this way, I want to say, give me the table. And once I say table, it'll give me all the books. Then to list is just to make it to list so that I do have what I have there. So I'll do two, so I will just do the get. And then for this, we'll have another get, but this will be get by ID. So I'll say ID. Then I'll say public async. Okay, so public async, get me a book. That's the ID. The first thing we're looking for is we're searching to say I like to use first or default. So first or default async. Then that would take where u goes to u dot id equal to the ID over there. Yeah, that's what I prefer. So we're saying go search to see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, return not found. If it exists, return a book. But I want to give actual API status, so I'll say okay, book. So now we're going to run it and see what it will look like in Scala. So our Scala loads, you see there are two there. There's the books and the books DB. We are interested in the books DB. So I'll open that. There should be two functions, the get. I'll test a request and send it. And you see that we get our 4 books. We can go to the next one and say test request, give us book number 2 and send. That gives us book number 2. If I put book number 22, then it should tell you book doesn't exist. Then our next thing is the C, the create or the post. So we're going to say fine HTTP post, then I'll say public async task action result book. So you will note that there's book there. Then you have the context books.add at the book. Unlike the repository we had earlier, you have to bring this code save changes. If you don't bring save changes, it will not add it to the database. It will just track on that. So this is very critical. Whenever you're changing the state, when you're getting it's fine, but updating, posting, deleting, whatever will affect, it will change the state of the database, you have to use save changes. So what I prefer to put here is what we did there. So you can say name get. There we go. Control dot. So return action created at name of. We have a get method over there, right? Okay, it's called getBook. So let's put getBook there. So this will create. There's something I want you to note. Number one, our book object has ID, but our database would do the ID on its own. That's something we have to consider. How are we going to handle that? Before we go any further, let's look at the Scala. So I want you to consider the ID there. So Scala loads books DB. There's the post over there. I'll say test request. And there will be something called ID there. So I'll leave ID 1 so that you see what happens. The title will be Romeo and Juliet, Standby Mark or Shakespeare. Let me say romance. Now, if I put ID, because you won't know what ID you're doing. If I put ID1 and I send this, it will throw an exception because ID1 already exists in my database. And also, the ID is handled by the database itself. So as a way for us to so you'll see that it creates an exception, which is an error card while changing the entity. Cannot insert explicit value for identity column books when the identity is set off. What entity framework is saying there is, you told me that I'll do it on my own. So why are you giving me the number? But if I put 0 there and send, something interesting will happen. You'll see that it creates a database, an entry with an ID 5. So it knows. But the question is, so how do we create things in a way that we are able to not give the ID, because the ID there is useless? So in our next video, we'll go to what we call automapper or object mapping. We want the user of our API, whoever is going to consume our API, to send the data that we need. In this case, we don't need ID. Then we can remove the ID because that will be handled in the backend. So in the next video, we're going to look at how do we do object mapping and only have that what we need. For now, we'll let it be like that. So I'll stop this and we'll proceed to the edit endpoint. So I'm going to get down there and I'll say HTTP put. Remember, put needs an ID. So I'll say ID. Then we'll say public async task, maybe action result. Action result. So it returns a no content like you've seen earlier. So that will be okay. Then we can say put. Then give me an int of ID as well as book and update book. So update book like so. Something similar to, okay. First of all, I would like to see if the ID you're giving me in the ID in the book, they're similar, right? Like we talked about that. So we do have that. If they're not similar, already return a bad request. Otherwise, you're going to say, give me the book and change the entity state modified. Then, since we're changing the content, we can do this. Alternatively, if somebody might ask, but we had done it a different way in this controller. We had brought in these guys over here. Yes, this could also work. If you do this, but it has to be update book. It has to be what? It has to be, okay. But if that has to work, then you have to have the if statement to also get the book. If that's what excites you, you can bring it here to say, well, get me the book, get me the update book, title, you do that, you do this, then you comment that out, right? Then what will happen is it will change these things. And don't forget, we save the changes. Let's just do the last one so that we do the delete as well, then we test. Okay, so the last one would be HTTP delete, and delete also needs to have an ID. Okay, so say give delete an ID. This would be public async task, could be an action result, then it will be delete, and delete will just take in the int ID like so, and this will be similar to this. you want to search for that. So search for it. If it exists, fine. If it does exist, then you want to write on your context, remove the book, but do not forget to save your changes, then return no content. And once you've done that, we're going to run this and see. So we have a books DB there. I'll just get our books first so that I'm able to copy that and go edit. We'll edit the first book. So I'll copy the great Gatsby rather. I'll go to put and I'll say test at request. Then the ID of that is 1. And here I'm going to copy the great Gatsby. Oh, okay. Funny thing, I did not copy and pasted it. Let's copy this. See that. Come to update the put, test the request. I have my 1 there, and I want to have my Gatsby there. Control V. And I can put there 2 just to show you that. Changed it to 2 over there. And you can send your request to the database. And that returns a 204 no content. So that was able to change. If I go get all and I change the Gatsby there, should change to have 222. Then I want to delete the 1984 by George Orwell, which is ID number 2. So I can go to delete, test, put ID number 2, and just hit send. That should go to your database and that should remove that. And if you get all books, we should have 3 books by now. So let's send the request and 1984 is gone. So if you're here, great work. Our next video, we want to see how do we bring in the auto mapper, how do we do the object mapping so that we are able to only send and expose what we want people to expose. We don't want people to see the structure of our database. We just want them to see models. So if you're ready, check the playlist. The video should be up there right now and running. Thank you very much.